The night was colder than she had ever felt before. The wind howled through the empty streets of the human colony, carrying tiny specks of frozen dust that cut against her skin like knives. Her thin alien body was shaking, her arms wrapped around herself as if that would keep the warmth from leaving her bones. Her clothes were nothing more than torn scraps, the fabric stiff with frost. Each step felt heavier than the last, and her bare feet left faint prints in the layer of white powder that had settled over the ground. She had no home, no friends, and no one who would care if she disappeared tonight. It had always been this way, ever since she could remember. Every night was a battle to survive the cold. Every day a fight to find scraps of food. She had never slept in a warm bed, not once in her life. The idea of lying under soft blankets, safe and warm, was something she had only heard about in whispered stories from others. She walked along the row of colony houses, their windows glowing faintly with golden light. From outside, she could see humans sitting at tables, eating hot meals. She could hear the sound of laughter, the faint hum of heaters, the smell of food drifting through cracks in the walls. It made the cold feel sharper, cooler. She tried knocking on a door once, but the human inside looked at her through the small viewing window and shook his head before closing it again. She tried a second house, then a third, but each time the reaction was the same, a look of pity, fear, or disgust, and then the sound of a door shutting her out. Her legs were numb now, the pain replaced by a dull ache. Her alien skin, a pale silver blue, had turned almost white under the frost. The markings on her cheeks glowed faintly, a natural trait of her species. When they were weak or close to fainting, she didn't know how much longer she could keep walking. Still, she forced herself forward, past the last cluster of homes, until the street narrowed into a quiet, dark lane. At the end of the lane stood a small wooden cabin, its roof dusted with snow, a dim light spilling from a single window. She hesitated, her breath clouding in the air. There was no reason to think this door would open for her when all the others had stayed shut. But her body was at its limit. She took the final steps toward the cabin, her knees trembling. She tried to knock, but her hand was so weak it barely made a sound. Her vision blurred, the cold swallowing the edges of her thoughts. Then the door opened. A tall human man stood in the doorway, his hair messy, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He wore a simple shirt and thick trousers, his hands still rough with what looked like work gloves. His gaze dropped to her feet, then to her shaking hands, then to her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling between the buildings. "You're freezing," he said at last, his voice low. She swallowed, her throat dry. I just need somewhere warm." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was thinking about something. He glanced over his shoulder into the cabin, then back at her. The law in this colony was clear. No human was allowed to take in alien without registration, and those who broke the rule could face heavy punishment. He knew that, and she knew that too, which was why she expected him to close the door like everyone else. Instead, he opened it wider. The warm air from inside brushed against her frozen skin, and for a moment she almost stepped back, unsure if this was real. "Come in," he said simply. She blinked, not moving. "Come in," he repeated, his tone firmer this time. She hesitated for one last second, then stepped over the threshold, her legs barely holding her weight. The warmth inside was almost overwhelming, making her eyes sting. The door closed behind her, shutting out the cold night. She stood there, unsure if she should speak, unsure if she should thank him. Her entire body still shook, but the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and something cooking. It was the first time in her life she felt heat sink into her skin. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he had opened the door, but deep down, a tiny part of her dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, this night would be different. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside, the cabin was quiet. The human man watched her closely, as if deciding something in his mind, and in that silence, the question burned in her. Would he really let her stay, Or was this only a moment of kindness before he sent her back into the cold? She stood just inside the door, unsure what to do. The warmth of the small cabin wrapped around her like a blanket, but her body still trembled from the cold outside. The human man closed the door behind her, his eyes never leaving her face, for a few seconds. There was silence, only the sound of the small heater humming in the corner. He could see how thin she was, how her clothes hung loosely from her frame, how frost clung to the ends of her hair. There were faint bruises along her arms, and her lips were cracked from the cold. "Sit," he said, pointing to a small wooden chair near the heater. She moved slowly, afraid to touch anything, and sat down without a word, her hands curled into her lap, fingers stiff from the freezing wind. He stepped into the kitchen corner and poured water into a metal pot, setting it on the heat. She watched him, her large alien eyes following every movement, as if expecting him to turn and order her out at any second. "What's your name?" he asked without looking at her. She hesitated, her voice small. "Raya," he nodded. "I'm Daniel." The way he said his name was calm, but she sensed something cautious behind his tone. He filled a cup with steaming water and dropped in something that smelled faintly sweet, then set it on the table in front of her. "Drink," he told her. She reached for it with shaking hands, taking a small sip, the heat spreading through her chest. "You're not from around here," he said quietly, though it was more a statement than a question. She lowered her eyes. "No. Where are you staying?" She shook her head. "Nowhere." The words came out so softly he almost didn't hear them. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. The law in the colony was strict. Humans were forbidden from housing alien refugees without permission. If the patrol found her here, both of them could face trouble, maybe worse. It would be safer for him to send her away now, before anyone noticed. But there was something in her eyes, something fragile yet stubborn, that made him hesitate. He remembered the patrols dragging people like her away in the past, their protests, swallowed by the cold night air. He remembered the look on their faces, the same look she had now, somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. She sipped the warm drink again, clutching it tightly as if it might vanish. "Why are you out?" "In the cold?" he asked. "I was looking for somewhere warm," she answered simply. Her voice was almost flat, as though she had given up expecting kindness. Daniel took a deep breath, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "You know it's not safe for you here," he said. She nodded slowly. "I know. Then why come to my door?" "I didn't think you'd open it," she admitted. "No one else did." That made him pause. The truth was, he almost hadn't. When he first saw her small figure in the doorway, he had thought of the rules, the risks, the trouble it could bring. But the thought of sending her back into that freezing darkness had been worse. He glanced at the clock on the wall, knowing patrols often made rounds at this hour. If they saw her outside, she wouldn't last the night. If they found her inside, he'd have to face the consequences. He stood suddenly, walking over to the window to check the street. The lane outside was empty, only the wind moving through it. He closed the curtain and turned back to her. "You can stay here tonight," he said at last. Raya's eyes widened, as if she wasn't sure she heard him correctly. "Stay here," she repeated. He nodded once. "But," she began, but stopped herself, unsure if questioning him might make him change his mind. "You look like you haven't had a warm night in years," he said. "So for tonight, this is where you'll rest." Something inside her seemed to crack at those words. She had slept in alleys, storage crates, and cold metal floors, but never had someone offer her a real place. Even if it was only for a night, it felt like something she couldn't turn down. She gave a small nod, still gripping the cup in her hands. Daniel walked toward the heater and adjusted it so the warmth reached her better. "You'll need food," he said, moving toward a cupboard. "I'm not. I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly. "You're not," he replied without looking back, his tone firm. He placed a plate of bread and a small bowl of stew in front of her. The smell made her stomach ache with hunger. She hesitated for a moment, then began eating slowly, her eyes flicking up to see if he was watching. He was, but not in a way that made her feel judged. When she finished, she set the spoon down carefully, almost too afraid to touch anything else. Daniel leaned against the table, watching her with a thoughtful expression. It was a dangerous choice he had made, but in his mind, it was the only one he could live with. The night outside grew darker, the wind louder. Somewhere in the distance, faint footsteps echoed on the frozen street. Raya froze, her hands tightening on the edge of the chair. Daniel looked toward the door, his jaw tightening. The patrol was making their rounds. He didn't know if they'd knock, but he knew one thing: if they did, he would have to stand between them and the alien girl now sitting in his home. And in that moment, his decision was made. She wasn't going back into the cold tonight, not while he was here. The heater's steady hum filled the cabin, spreading warmth into every corner. Raya sat quietly in the wooden chair, her thin fingers wrapped around the empty cup she had been holding for nearly an hour. She had stopped shivering as much, but her body still ached from the cold she had endured for so long. Daniel sat across the table, his arms folded, watching her in the dim light. He had given her food, water, and a place to sit, but the night was only beginning, and the cold outside was not the kind one could recover from in a single evening. "You can't stay in that chair all night," he said at last, breaking the silence. She looked at him cautiously, unsure what he meant. "You need to sleep," he added. "Proper sleep, not sitting up in a corner." Rukia's eyes flicked toward the far side of the room, where a small bed sat neatly against the wall. The thick blankets looked impossibly warm compared to the frozen alley she was used to. She quickly looked away, afraid he might see the longing in her eyes. "I can sit here," she murmured. "It's fine." "It's not fine," Daniel said firmly. "That's my bed over there." Her breath caught. "Your bed?" "Yes," he said, his tone casual. "And you're going to use it tonight." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. "No, I can't. That's yours." "I've slept in worse places," he replied. "You need it more than I do." She didn't answer, but he could see the doubt on her face, the way she curled in on herself like she was afraid of taking up too much space. Daniel stood and walked over to the bed, pulling the blankets back. He patted the mattress lightly. "Come on," he said. "It's better than freezing in that chair." Raya stayed where she was, her hands gripping the cup again, as if it was a shield. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one's ever given me a bed before." The words made him pause. "Ever?" She shook her head. "Not once." For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to say. In his mind, a bed was something simple, something everyone had. But for her, it was something impossible. "Well," he said at last, "there's a first time for everything." He walked over to her, gently taking the cup from her hands and setting it on the table. Then he held out his hand, not forcing her, just waiting. Slowly, she stood, her bare feet padding softly across the wooden floor. The moment she reached the bed, she hesitated again, almost as if she was afraid to ruin it. "Go on," he encouraged. "It's just a bed, not a trap." She gave him a small, unsure smile before climbing in, her body sinking into the soft mattress. The warmth of the blankets surrounded her instantly, and she almost gasped at the feeling. It was nothing like the cold, hard surfaces she was used to. Her head sank into the pillow, and for a second she thought she might cry. Daniel stepped back, watching her relax for the first time since she had entered. "You'll sleep better here," he said. "Trust me." She nodded faintly, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The smell of clean fabric and wood smoke filled her senses. Her eyes grew heavy, though she kept glancing at him as if to make sure he wasn't going to change his mind. Daniel walked to a chair near the fire and sat down, leaning back. "You're not sleeping here?" she asked quietly. "No," he replied. "I'll keep the fire going so you stay warm." Her brow furrowed. "You don't have to." "I know," he said simply. "But I will." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of the wind outside was faint now. Muffled by the walls, it was the safest she had felt in years, and she didn't know what to do with that feeling. But before sleep could take her, a sudden noise made her eyes snap open. 3 heavy knocks echoed through the cabin, sharp and deliberate. Daniel's head turned toward the door instantly. Raya's heart began to race, her fingers tightening around the blanket. She didn't need to ask. She knew it was the colony patrol. The sound of boots crunching over snow followed. And a voice called out, "Daniel, open up." Daniel stood slowly, his eyes flicking toward the bed. "Stay quiet," he said in a low voice. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled the blanket over her head. She could hear him walking to the door, his footsteps steady. The knock came again, louder this time. "Coming." He called out, his voice calm but firm. He unlocked the door, and the cold night air rushed in as he cracked it open. 2 patrol officers stood outside, their heavy coats dusted with snow. "Evening," one of them said. "We're checking for any unauthorized aliens in the area. Have you seen anything?" Daniel's grip on the door didn't loosen. "No," he said simply. "Just me here." The patrolman's eyes shifted past him, scanning the small space they could see. Raya stayed perfectly still under the blankets, her body tense. After a moment, the officer gave a short nod. "All right, stay safe." The door closed. The lock clicked, and Daniel turned back toward the bed. "You're safe," he said quietly. Only then did she let out the breath she had been holding, her heart still pounding. As the firelight flickered across the room, she realized something. It wasn't just the bed that was warm. It was the feeling of being protected, and that, she thought, might be the rarest thing she had ever known. The cabin was quiet again after the patrol left. Only the soft crackle of the fire and the low hum of the heater filled the air. Daniel walked back to his chair near the fireplace and sat down, his eyes glancing toward Raya to make sure she was all right. She was still tucked under the blankets, her breathing fast from the fear that had just passed. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were wide, as if she still couldn't believe he had lied to protect her. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I did," Daniel replied without hesitation. "I'm not throwing you back out into that cold." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She didn't know how to respond to a kindness like that. No one had ever chosen her safety over their own. It felt strange, almost unreal. He leaned back in the chair, stretching his legs toward the fire. "You should try to sleep now," he told her. "You're safe here." Raya nodded slowly, letting the blankets pull tighter around her. The warmth seeped into her bones, and the soft mattress cradled her body in a way she had never experienced before. It was almost too comfortable, too gentle, and for a moment she was afraid to close her eyes, afraid it might all vanish if she did. But Daniel didn't move from his chair. Every so often, he reached forward and added another log to the fire, making sure it didn't burn low. The glow from the flames cast a warm light over the room, chasing away the shadows. Her breathing began to slow as her body relaxed. She listened to the steady rhythm of his movements, the sound of the fire crackling, the faint creak of the chair when he shifted. It was a sound of safety, one she had never known before. Her mind wandered back to her past nights, sleeping in storage crates, curled up in abandoned alleys, hiding under thin metal sheets to block the wind. She remembered waking up with her fingers numb, her lips cracked, her skin aching from the cold. Sometimes she had wondered if one night she simply wouldn't wake up at all. Now lying here, it felt like she had stepped into another world entirely. Daniel noticed her eyes slowly closing, her body sinking deeper into the bed. "Rest, Raya," he said softly. "You've earned it." She gave the faintest nod, her eyelids growing heavier. The sound of the wind outside was now distant, muted by the walls. For the first time in her life, she felt warm from head to toe, but the night was not without its tension. Somewhere outside, footsteps crunched in the snow again. Daniel's head lifted instantly, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, The sound passed by the cabin, slow but steady. Raya's eyes opened halfway, catching the faint flicker of worry in his expression. "Is it them again?" She whispered. "Not this time," he replied quietly. "Just someone passing." She relaxed slightly, though her heart still beat faster than it should. An hour passed, then another. Daniel fought off sleep, determined to keep watch until the first light of morning. Raya, however, eventually surrendered to the warmth. Drifting into a deep sleep, her breathing became soft and steady, her face finally free of the tension it had carried since stepping into his home. She shifted once, curling into the blanket like a small child holding onto the promise of safety. He watched her for a long while, his thoughts tangled. He had no idea who she had been before she arrived at his door. He didn't know what kind of life she had endured, only that it had been a hard one. But one thing was clear: she didn't belong out there in the cold. No one did. And as long as she was under his roof, she wouldn't have to. Outside, the wind began to slow, the snow settling in silence. The world seemed frozen in place, except for the soft glow of the fire and the quiet breathing from the bed. Daniel leaned forward, adding one last log to the flames, then sat back again. His eyes grew heavier, but he stayed awake, watching the shadows dance along the wooden walls. The hours stretched on, until the first pale light of dawn began to touch the window. Raya stirred, her eyes blinking open slowly. For a moment she looked confused, as if she had forgotten where she was. Then she saw the fire, the blankets, and Daniel sitting nearby, and her shoulders relaxed. "You stayed up all night?" she asked quietly. He shrugged. Someone had to keep the fire going. Her throat tightened, and she turned her face into the blanket so he wouldn't see the tears threatening to fall. It had been a long time since anyone had cared enough to stay awake for her sake. The warmth of the night still clung to her skin, and a thought came unbidden into her mind. She never wanted to go back to the cold. Not ever again. The pale light of morning had barely touched the snow outside when Daniel heard it. 3 sharp knocks against the cabin door, not the slow, wandering sound of a passing traveler, but firm, official knocks. Raya froze on the bed, her fingers clutching the blanket so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. Daniel's eyes met hers, and in that glance she knew it was the patrol. The knocks came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Daniel!" "Patrol inspection. Open the door." Daniel stood slowly, his expression calm on the surface, but his jaw was set. "Stay there," he said to Raya in a low voice. "Don't move, don't make a sound." Her heart pounded so hard it felt like the sound would give her away. She curled deeper under the blankets, pulling them over her head, as if hiding could make her invisible. Daniel crossed the room, each step deliberate. He unlocked the door and opened it halfway, letting in a sharp gust of cold air. 2 colony patrol officers stood there, dressed in heavy coats and armed with sidearms at their belts. Their breath came out in white clouds, and their eyes scanned him quickly. "Morning," Daniel said evenly, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Morning," one of the officers replied. "We're checking for any unauthorized aliens in this sector. Reports say someone was seen walking through here last night." Daniel's mind worked quickly. The description fit Raya perfectly, but admitting she was inside meant handing her over, and he wasn't about to do that. "Haven't seen anyone," he said, keeping his voice calm. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Mind if we take a look inside?" Daniel's grip on the door tightened slightly, though his face showed no change. "Is that necessary?" "It's just me here," he replied. The second officer stepped forward, his gaze shifting past Daniel toward the warm interior of the cabin. From under the blanket, Raya's breathing quickened. Every creak of the wooden floor under their boots sounded like thunder in her ears. If they stepped inside, they'd see her in an instant. Daniel shifted his stance subtly, blocking as much of their view as possible. "I keep to myself," he said. "If someone came by last night, they didn't stop here." The first officer's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer. as if weighing his words. Then, slowly he stepped back. "All right," he said. "If you see anything, you're required to report it immediately." Daniel gave a short nod. "Understood." The officers exchanged a glance, then turned and walked away, their boots crunching against the snow until the sound faded into the distance. Daniel closed the door and locked it, leaning against the wood for a brief moment. Only then did Raya peek out from under the blanket, her wide eyes fixed on him. "They're gone," he said quietly. She sat up slowly, her hands trembling. "They would have taken me," she said, her voice shaking. "Yes," Daniel admitted, "and I couldn't let that happen." She stared at him, searching for the reason. "You could get in trouble," she whispered. "I know," he said simply, "but you're not going back out there." Something in his voice was so firm, so certain, that it silenced her for a moment. She swallowed, her throat tight. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why?" "Are you helping me?" Daniel met her gaze, his expression steady. "Because I've seen what happens to people like you when no one helps," he said. "And I won't be part of that." The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. Raya lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. No one had ever taken such a risk for her before. It made her feel strange, grateful, scared, and something else she couldn't quite name. Daniel walked to the table and poured her another cup of hot tea. "You should drink this," he said, setting it down for her. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the steam warm her face. Her mind replayed the sound of the officers' voices, the way their boots had crunched on the snow. She knew they could come back, maybe with more men, and if they did, Daniel would be in even more danger because of her. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly, not looking at him. "No," he said instantly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're safe here." "But," she began. "No," he repeated. "You've been running long enough." She stared into the tea, her reflection rippling with each tiny movement of the cup. A part of her still didn't believe this could last. Kindness was never free in her world. There was always a price. But looking at him now, she couldn't find the usual calculation in his eyes. Only resolve. Outside, the morning grew brighter, but inside, the cabin still felt like a small island in the middle of a frozen wasteland. For now, the patrol was gone. For now, she was safe. But the unspoken truth lingered between them. Sooner or later, the patrol would return. And when they did, Daniel would have to choose again. The day passed slowly. Outside, the snow kept falling in soft sheets, covering the path to the cabin until it almost disappeared. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and the small space felt warmer than Raya had ever known, yet her mind would not rest. Even though the patrol was gone for now, their voices still echoed in her head. She sat on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest, staring into the flames. Daniel had kept busy, chopping wood outside for most of the afternoon. When he returned, his boots tracked small bits of snow across the floor, but he didn't seem to mind. He set the wood by the fireplace and glanced toward her. "You haven't moved much," he said, his tone gentle. She shook her head slowly. "I'm not used to this," she said, her voice soft. "This?" he asked. "Being warm, being safe," she replied, almost embarrassed. Daniel sat in the chair near the fire, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've been through worse than cold, haven't you?" he asked quietly. Her eyes flicked toward him, unsure if she should answer, but something in his steady gaze made her feel like she could. After a long pause, she nodded. "Yes," she said. "Much worse." She took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "I was taken when I was very young, maybe 6 or 7 cycles old. I don't remember exactly." Daniel stayed silent, letting her continue. "They came to my village, soldiers. Not from my people, not from yours either," she said. "They burned everything, took whoever they could carry." Her hands tightened around the blanket as if holding onto it for strength. "I was small, so they sold me to a mining crew." She paused, her eyes far away now. "For years, I worked in the dark tunnels, digging, carrying heavy loads, sometimes for days without seeing sunlight. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. They never gave us enough food, never enough rest. And if we slowed down... Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. They hurt you. Daniel said quietly. She nodded. After some time I learned to keep my head down, do as they said, never speak unless spoken to. Her gaze dropped to the floor. One day, the mine collapsed in one section. I managed to crawl out. But many didn't. I ran and ran, hiding in transport trucks, following anyone who seemed like they were heading somewhere far. Her voice broke slightly. I thought if I could get far enough, maybe I could find a place to start over. Daniel leaned back, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. And instead, you ended up here, he said. She gave a faint nod. Yes, but this colony is no better. They don't want people like me, unjust. Something they see as trouble. Daniel's eyes softened. You're not trouble, Raya. She let out a small, bitter laugh. To them I am, to everyone I've met until last night. I am, her voice quieted, almost disappearing. That's why I knock quietly, so if they don't want me, I can leave before they have to push me away. He studied her for a moment, then spoke with quiet certainty. You knocked on my door, and I opened it. I'm not closing it on you. She looked at him, trying to read his expression, trying to see if there was any sign of a lie, but all she saw was the same calm resolve she had seen when he stood against the patrol. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then she whispered, Why? Daniel shrugged slightly. Because I've seen enough bad in this world, and I won't add to it. His voice was simple, but it carried a weight that made her chest feel tight. She turned her face away, wiping at her eyes before he could notice, though she suspected he already had, as night began to fall again. Daniel brought her a bowl of hot stew. She accepted it with both hands, the heat soaking into her fingers. You don't owe me anything, he said as she ate slowly. I'm not keeping a score. She froze for a second, the spoon halfway to her mouth. That's not how it works where I'm from, she said. Then maybe where you're from is wrong, he replied without hesitation. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, though it didn't last long. She still couldn't shake the thought of the patrol coming back. They'll be watching for me, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Maybe, but they won't get you while you're here. It was such a bold statement, so sure, that she didn't know whether to believe it or not, but a small part of her wanted to, and that was enough to make her hold on to his words. Later, when the firelight grew dim, and the cabin settled into quiet, she lay under the blankets again. Her body finally felt warm enough that the cold seemed like a memory instead of a threat. Her mind, however, was still caught between the past and the present. But when she glanced toward Daniel sitting in the chair, still awake and keeping watch, she felt something strange, something she hadn't felt in years, the beginning of trust. Morning light filtered gently through the small cabin window. The fire had burned low in the night, leaving only glowing embers, but the room still held the warmth from the long hours before. Raya stirred under the blankets, her eyes opening. Slowly, for a moment she simply lay still, listening. The quiet was different here, not the tense silence of hiding in an alley, but the calm silence of safety. Daniel was in the kitchen corner, quietly preparing something over the small stove. The smell of fresh bread and hot tea drifted through the air. When she sat up, he glanced over his shoulder and gave a small nod. Morning, he said, his tone casual but kind. She returned the greeting softly, still adjusting to the idea that someone could speak to her without suspicion or cruelty. He placed a plate and cup on the table, then gestured for her to join him. She hesitated for only a moment before sliding out of the bed, her bare feet touching the wooden floor. It was strange. The floor was cool, but not the biting cold she had always known. She sat at the table and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite. You sleep all right? Daniel asked. Yes, she said, then paused. Better than I ever have. He didn't say much after that, letting her eat in peace. When she finished, He took her plate without comment and rinsed it in the small sink. Raya watched him. The quiet movements, the way he didn't rush her or demand anything. It was still new to her, this rhythm of kindness without a hidden demand. After a while, Daniel leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said plainly. Her head lifted quickly, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. "You mean, not just one night?" she asked. "That's what I mean," he replied. The words sank into her like warmth from the fire. She had been ready to pack her few things, ready to slip away before the patrol came back, but now she wasn't sure she could walk away from this place. "But the patrol," she began. "They'll come again," Daniel interrupted. "And when they do, I'll be ready." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had never met anyone who spoke about protecting her as if it was obvious. As if it wasn't even a question, he walked over to the fire and stirred the embers, adding a log so the heat began to rise again. Then he looked back at her, his voice steady. "You've been running for too long, Raya. You need a place where you can stop, breathe, and live without fear." Her chest tightened, the truth of his words hitting her harder than she expected. All the years of running, of hiding, of knocking on doors that never opened, and now one had opened, and stayed open. She lowered her gaze, her voice quiet. "I don't know how to stay in one place." "Then you'll learn," he said simply. The certainty in his tone made something inside her shift. Maybe she could. Maybe for once in her life she could stop looking over her shoulder every moment. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, and both of them glanced toward it. Outside, the snow was falling again, heavy and thick. The colony patrol would not be traveling in this weather. For now, they were safe. Daniel moved to the small shelf near his bed and pulled out an extra blanket, placing it on the chair beside hers. "In case you get cold later," he said. She looked at it, then at him. The gesture simple, but somehow heavy with meaning. They spent most of the day quietly, Daniel working on small repairs around the cabin, while Raya helped where she could. She fetched wood for the fire, cleaned dishes, and even mended a tear in one of his shirts. Every so often, he would glance at her with a small nod, as if to say he noticed her efforts. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. It was better, because it was hers, and no one could take it from her here. Not as long as Daniel kept his promise. When night began to fall again, Raya sat near the fire, the orange light dancing across her face. Daniel poured 2 mugs of tea and handed one to her before sitting in the chair across from her. For a while they drank in silence, the sound of the fire filling the space between them. Then she spoke, her voice low. "I never had a warm bed before you." He met her gaze steadily. "And you'll never have to sleep cold again," he said. The words settled deep into her, like an unspoken vow. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen land, but inside the cabin there was warmth, light, and a promise that felt stronger than the storm. For the first time in her life, Raya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be her home.